following is a local resident producers program. The program content is the sole responsibility of the producer and does not necessarily reflect the views or policies of CATV2, Oshkosh Community Media Services, the City of Oshkosh, or Time Warner Cable.
Hi everybody, welcome to Eye on Oshkosh. Cheryl Hentz here, and very happy to be continuing our candidate interviews for the upcoming election in November. And on this edition, we're very happy to welcome to the show Mark Harris. I'm sure most of you know Mark. He's been around here for an awful long time. He's been on the city council. He's been just a councilman. He's been our mayor. He's been county executive for how many years, Mark?
9 years now.
9 years now. So he's a very familiar face. And now he's seeking a new office, that for the 6th Congressional District seat, trying to take over the position that has been held by a longtime Congressman, Tom Petri. Thank you. I'm starting to lose my voice here already. Anyway, Tom has been in office for 30-some years and has decided not to seek re-election. So Mark is running as the Democrat. There's a Libertarian running, and there are also 2 Republicans who are running. Joe Leibham, he's a state senator, and then also another state senator, Glenn Crothman. I don't know, they were 214 votes away from each other in the primary election. And so there's probably going to be a recount, but Senator Leibham is not sure if he's going to ask for one or not. So I guess we'll have to see. But whoever is the Republican will get him on the show. And I'd like to try and get Libertarian Gus Ferendorf on as well. Anyway, joining me and interviewing Mark tonight are Tony Palmeri. You, of course, know him from the former commentary show and the city council. And he's taken a stab at state office as well, right? And also joining us is Emilie Heidemann. She is a journalism student at UWO, and she's also an intern working for the Oshkosh Scene magazine, which we are kind of co-working with, co-sponsoring these interviews, and so we're happy to have everyone here tonight. So, Mark, with all that being said, welcome again. Now, as I understand it, the Board of Canvassers in each county for this district had until tomorrow, I guess, Friday. We're taping this on the 21st to sort of finalize their votes and everything. And at that point, then, a recount can be requested if Leibham wants it. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think he has 3 days from the completion of the canvassing, and they actually finished that early.
Okay.
So I think the time probably started running yesterday.
Okay.
And because he was within 0.5%, the difference was less than that.
Yeah.
That he can have a free recount if he requests it.
Yeah, it was very, very close. 0.3 percentage point. So I don't know. I'm thinking that he should ask for a recount. I certainly would. But well, so why are you? You know, you've been around for a long time now. Why are you looking at taking a step forward into a higher office?
Well, I think I can make a difference. You know, I've always been good at working with budgets, and certainly the issue with the federal government right now is how are we going to rein in this gap between the spending and the revenues that are running up more debt, and how are we going to deal with the outstanding debt in the long term? And depending on who's driving that process, the outcome might be very, very different.
Mm-hmm. You have, we were talking about the two Republican candidates who are kind of neck and neck. You have issued to both of them
That's right.
a challenge to do a debate in each county in the district. Have you heard from anyone yet?
We've not heard back anything officially, and there's 11 counties where either all or part of the county is in this congressional district, and I really think the people of each of those counties deserves to have a local debate so they have access to the candidates and to the differing theories on how they want to proceed.
Sure. Well, that's, you know, I admire you for doing that, but that's an ambitious kind of schedule. I mean, how will you fit that in with your duties as county executive?
Well,
or any campaigning for that
sure.
matter?
Typically the debates are in evenings or on the weekends.
Okay.
It is going to involve a little driving, but I'm doing a lot of that
I
now.
suppose, yeah.
Actually, yesterday I was in 3 different communities, you know, doing a little bit of greeting in either restaurants or taverns, and stopped at 3 newspapers and talked to the editorial staff. So, you know, you have to take a little time off work, but there's a lot of travel involved. It's a fairly large district. All the districts have the same population, and the lower your population density, the larger the boundaries are. So, you know, this goes down to Port Washington and actually dips a little bit into Milwaukee County in the southeast.
Yeah, it's like by Ozaki or something, isn't it?
All of Ozaki County is
Okay.
in here, but
All
even
right.
a little bit of Milwaukee County.
Okay, okay.
It goes up to 2 rivers
Wow.
in the northeast, and it even has part of Wisconsin Dells in this district way over on the west
That's
side.
big. I bet you are doing a
Yeah.
lot of driving. Do you have a preference as to who you'd like to run against?
Well, whichever Republican is the one that the Republican voters elected in the primary, that's the one I want to face. Right now the count shows that Glenn Grothman is ahead. If there's no recount, that's where it'll stand. If Joe Lipham requests a recount, you know, it is close enough race that it's conceivable that it would change, and I think the voters are going to want to be sure that the candidate that they chose is the one that I'm facing for
Sure.
the election in November.
Just one other question before, you know, Tony and Emily take over here. You know, how have you been received in some of these other areas? Like I said, you've been around this area for a long time. Everybody knows you. I think everybody, you know, knows where you stand on a lot of the issues. But in other areas, they don't know Mark Harris from Adam.
That's right. I'm very unknown in some parts of the district, and as I go out and meet people, that's helping. I'm actually getting pretty well received anywhere that I speak. I've always thought of myself as more of a moderate, and because there was a Republican primary, and it seems to me that all the Republican candidates were afraid of any of the other candidates flanking them to the right, that they've taken some pretty far right positions, and my positions come across as more moderate. I really want to find real solutions to the real problems that people face. I don't want to get bogged down in these political issues that really aren't that important to the public.
Yeah.
Well, that's a good segue, Mark. I'm interested in what kind of a Democrat you are. I mean, we currently have 3 Democrats from Wisconsin in the House of Representatives. Gwen Moore and Mark Bocan are in the Progressive Caucus.
Sure.
And Ron Kind is more of a moderate conservative Democrat. So I take it if you got elected, you would not join the Progressive Caucus with Gwen Moore and Mark Bocan.
When I've heard them speak, I've often thought that Ron Kind seems to think a lot like I thought I did. So I probably would be more like Ron Kind.
Well, what do you disagree with the progressives? For example, they would like to see a $10.10 minimum wage. Do you disagree with that?
Actually, my proposal is a little different than that. I think that the problem with minimum wage is that it's good when they raise it and then it languishes for years because they're waiting for Congress to decide whether they're going to act again. I would like to see it indexed to the prior year's average hourly wage. And obviously anything like that's going to have to be negotiated, but what I would suggest is that it get indexed to 42% of the prior year's average hourly wage. That would currently be $8.53. And that any time the minimum wage would drop below 40% of the average hourly wage, it would automatically be reset at 42%. So if wages are rising for other people, I want the minimum wage to go up automatically and not wait for Congress to act. And I think that'd be more predictable for both employees and employers. Over 3 years,
yeah,
that might approach the 10-10.
And might not.
Or it might not. It would go up the first 2 years almost certainly, because if you raise the 10% of the workforce that's now at 7.25 to 853, the average will go up. And that would probably cause a smaller adjustment the second year. But if wages stagnate for other people, then the minimum might stagnate as well.
I know Emilie's got a question about the minimum wage.
I just want to know what you would consider a reasonable rate, especially for tip staff, because I know that it's really, really low for them right now.
Yeah, I don't know the exact amount off the top of my head, but I'm thinking 240 or 240.
233, I believe, because I used to be a waitress. So.
Yeah, that's not reasonable.
No.
Maybe the ratio of the tipped wage to the minimum could stay constant, but really, you know, a waitress working in a restaurant with an expensive menu might make good money, but a waitress working in a place with relatively inexpensive food cannot make enough money to support herself. It's got to be adjusted, and you know, maybe you would set that at half the other minimum wage so that it would be moving as well. The current level is really totally unacceptable.
Do you ever see a time mark? I mean, because it's been like this for all of time, but would you ever envision a time when that might change and restaurants just be like every other business? They have to provide a minimum wage, a standard minimum wage like every other business, because I've always thought it was highly unfair of a restaurant owner to just assume that the customer is going to pick up the slack. And at that point then, they're only bringing that server or cook, because I know a lot of places share with the cooks, up to possibly minimum wage standard at that rate. I mean, you know, you're still expecting the customers to pay what any other employer would have to pay.
It seems to be completely ingrained in our culture, so I don't know that I would be challenging that, but I have to agree with you. You could get in the situation where someone's working very hard, but because they're working in a restaurant that has very affordable food, that they just can't make a living no matter how many hours they work. That just doesn't seem right.
Yeah.
Mark, a different issue. Whoever your opponent is, he's going to stand for repealing the Affordable Care Act, or Obamacare. What is your view on what needs to happen with the Affordable Care Act at this point?
You know, there's parts of the Affordable Care Act that almost everyone seems to like. So why would you throw the whole thing out? And what concerns me is that they're not proposing something to take its place. They're talking about throwing it out and then I suppose starting over. But wouldn't it make much more sense to keep what they like about it and to correct the rough spots? People love that their children under age 26 can continue to get coverage under their parents' insurance.
Right.
We got lots of people coming out of school that are not finding jobs that provide benefits. People love that. People that have ongoing illnesses that are expensive seem to love the fact that the $1 million maximum has been taken out, because for some illnesses, $1 million is not enough to cover you.
But Mark, all of the popular parts of it can only happen with the unpopular part of it, which is the mandate, which is basically people Emilie's age have to be compelled to buy this insurance that they may not want. So you support the individual mandate, then, I take it? The unpopular part of Obamacare.
If you want the program paid for, there's going to have to be unpopular features to pay for it. And the people that suggest you can just have the good parts without any of the efforts to pay for it, for instance, even a lot of Democrats don't like the tax on the best insurance coverage, the Cadillac plans, but at least there's been an effort to try and pay for the Affordable Health Care Act. So whatever they do, we can't afford to run up more debt. And you know, that's a general problem that we've been facing, is that some politicians are telling the public, you can have what you want and you don't have to pay for it.
Right.
I think the public is yearning for someone
But so it
that
sounds,
will tell them the truth.
all right, so it sounds like you would keep the Affordable Care Act the way it is, essentially.
I'm open-minded to changes that would make it better.
You wouldn't-
I would consider changes.
All right, you called yourself a moderate before, so you wouldn't support a genuine a national health care plan, like a Canadian-style program. If you had your way, would you support something like that?
I think we're probably going to head towards that eventually, but I don't think we're ready for it yet.
So you wouldn't lead on something like that?
Probably wouldn't lead.
On what grounds aren't we ready for it yet?
Well, I don't think we're ready to pay the cost of that type of coverage. But I think we'll head there eventually, and that this may be a transition. But I'm not, that's not a high priority for me to push for national health care at this time. I would rather see them make improvements to make the Affordable Care Act work well. But you certainly can't throw the whole thing out. And I started to talk about, you know, they like the insurance for the kids under 26.
Sure.
They like the lifetime maximum taken out. They like that your insurance company can't take away your insurance if you actually get sick.
Mm-hmm.
They like that if you or your spouse have an ongoing illness, that you can still change jobs without losing coverage. There was a time where if you or your spouse had an illness, that if you tried to change employers, that would be a pre-existing condition and you wouldn't have coverage. And it trapped people
Yep.
in employment they didn't really like. All of those things are very popular with the public. And some of the people that are saying, oh, that Affordable Health Care Act is terrible, I don't think they realize most of it are things that are generally supported by the public. So let's make it better. Let's not throw it out.
Okay, Emily?
Well, you can directly connect that to budget and spending. Well, one side wants lower taxes while the other side wants more spending, maybe in areas of socioeconomic issues. As far as budget and spending is concerned, how do you plan to manage the budget in a way that's good for maybe long-term fiscal health? And like, what about meeting the needs of working class families and restoring the middle class?
Yeah, the middle class has taken it on the chin in the last 20 years. But what we have to do with the budget, we're in a recovery now. We're going to have to dedicate the bulk of the new revenues from recovery to reducing the gap between the spending and the taxes.
So what you're saying is that we need to find some sort of balance. So how would you propose that we do find that balance?
And it's all going to have to be negotiated and compromised. But let me make a point. The amount of the GDP that's being taken out for federal taxes, for all forms of taxes, income, excise, even payroll taxes, is relatively low compared to the post-war average. And you could have a healthy economy that taxed 15% of the GDP and spent 15%, and that would be a very small government model. Very small, much smaller than it is now. Or you could have a big government model that taxed, 22% of the GDP and spent 22%. What you can't do is what we're trying to do right now, and that's tax 15, which, by the way, is very close to a 60-year low, and then spend 22.
So are you saying then that you're more for a progressive tax?
I am for progressive taxes. Clearly there's a difference between taxing away someone's grocery money and taxing away their green fees at the country club, but within reason, because you don't want to discourage success either. But all of my potential opponents have taken an absolute no tax increase pledge, and they've signed on to balancing the budget in 1 year. And that would be catastrophic.
And that leads me back to my point earlier. One side wants lower taxes, one side wants more spending, and no side seems to be willing to compromise in those areas. And that's good that you are willing to compromise at least.
Yeah, and that's not, and it goes a step further, because Glenn Grothman, for instance, says, send him to Washington to deal with excess spending and debt. And he says, I'd like to do to Washington what I've done in Wisconsin. Wisconsin state debt is at an all-time high right now, an all-time high, and rising at a rapid rate. Wisconsin state spending is at an all-time high. And in fact, during his time in the legislature, the debt has more than tripled, and the spending has roughly doubled. So he hasn't accomplished what he said he has. And if you applied this, cutting taxes for the wealthy, something he's done at the state level, continuing to increase spending, and then borrowing the difference.
Well, he claims Act 10 got rid of our structural deficit.
Yeah.
You're saying we've got the biggest debt ever. Who's telling the truth here?
Well, the numbers are easy to verify. The state debt's at an all-time high. It's over $14 billion. And it's also easy to verify that the state spending's at an all-time high. Act 10 certainly cut a lot of spending in some areas, but it didn't reduce the total below where it had been before. And Mr. Grothman pushed through tax credits for manufacturing and agriculture that will virtually eliminate income tax on those two types of corporations. But in addition to that, those credits pass through to the individuals. And so if you own a manufacturing business, for instance, as an S-corp or a partnership, that even your individual income taxes will be wiped out on the first $3.2 million. You can have a married couple that own a factory and their nephew who works full-time at Taco Bell. The nephew will pay more income tax than the couple that own the factory. And the nephew's marginal tax rate will be like 27 times higher than theirs because the credits will wipe out all but 1/7 of 1%.
Sure.
And this is something that Glenn Grothman inserted in the state budget, not the most recent budget, but the one before that, but it's just starting to phase in now. So, he says send him there to do for Washington what he's done for Wisconsin. But when I look at what he's done in Wisconsin, it's more of the fiscal craziness that has made us suspicious of Washington. It's not right.
Right.
Sure.
Excuse me. I think it's great, Mark, that you want to go to Washington and compromise in order to get things done. But the reality is, unfortunately, we've heard that from other people in the past, and they can't seem to get anything done because so many people aren't of that mindset. They want to, toe the party line over and over and over again. If they are even beginning to waver just a little bit, they start getting pressure from their fellow party members. I mean, do you have a thought as to how you can make this work?
Well, I know that they have to build a center where people can work across the aisle, and we're going to have to do that one House seat at a time. But Kennedy once said something that was interesting. He said, don't look for the Republican answer, don't look for the Democratic answer, look for the right answer. And don't spend your time fixing blame for the past. Let's take responsibility for the future. And we're getting to the point we need to act on some important issues. And the answers are not going to be popular. We have to make some tough choices. And it's time that someone is at least in Congress talking about those tough choices.
Okay, so what are the tough choices on Medicare and Medicaid, for example?
Medicare and Medicaid is a tough one, but if we want to continue those programs in their current form, and I think we do, then we're going to have a sufficient source of revenue to cover that.
All right, so how do we develop the revenue to keep the Medicare program healthy?
That's actually the toughest one, but you probably have to raise the payroll tax for Medicaid and Medicare. And then with Social Security, you've got the same issue where so many people are proposing to change Social Security. And, they'll point to the youngest person in the room and they'll say, Social Security is not going to be there when you're ready to retire. Well, that's absurd. Because as long as the payroll taxes are going into Social Security, then there's money available to pay a benefit. So the real issue is, with changing demographics, can we keep the size of the benefit adequate? Well, I don't think we can afford not to, with so many Americans with no pension. If you don't have something like Social Security with a benefit that's fixed for life, I don't see how they're going to know how much money they can spend. I don't know how they'll have any income security. So I think we have to keep it in its present form, We're probably going to have to make some changes to the system. And again, they're not going to be popular, but they're necessary.
Well, one of the tough choices would be lifting that cap, right? There's a certain income level at which you don't pay any more Social Security tax, correct?
That's correct.
So is one of the tough choices to get rid of that cap?
Yeah, actually, lifting the cap would be one of the tough choices.
All
That's
right.
not a bad one. I would actually prefer to put a small excise tax on wages in excess of the cap, only because when you lift the cap, you bring more money into the system currently, but that cap is also part of the computation of the benefit for high-income Social Security recipients. So when you lift the cap, you'll be increasing their benefit as well later on. So you bring more money in initially, but later you've built up more benefits. The better solution is to put a small tax on wages in excess of the cap so that you're bringing more money into the system, but not necessarily raising the Social Security benefit of the highest income earners. You know, quite frankly, I'm more concerned with the average working person having enough money to get by in retirement than I am for people who have had very large incomes and the opportunity to save, having a larger Social Security benefit.
All right, what about Medicaid, Mark? Because the Obama administration with the Affordable Care Act has made, I think, a fairly dramatic commitment to Medicaid, right?
Sure.
Any state that accepts it, the feds will cover it, I believe, 100% for the first 3 years. Is that right?
I think it was 100% for two,
For 2 years,
and then 90%
then 90,
for
right.
two.
So that's a huge commitment.
It is.
All right, so given what you're telling us about your concern with budget and revenue, how does that Medicaid commitment square with that?
Well, if you're asking, is it going to be expensive? Yes.
Right, yeah.
But I think it's something that we should fund.
Okay. But
And I have not taken a no tax pledge. I know you have to be careful with taxes, and as county executive, I have been.
right.
Some years they've gone up, some years they've gone down. I've actually reduced spending, but because I've had to backfill for lost state support at the county, I haven't reduced the taxes.
Right.
Some years they went up, some years they went down. The rates are about where they started.
Okay. But not to get tied up in the healthcare issue, but Emily before asked you, why aren't we ready for, say, the Canadian-style system? With all we're doing with Medicaid funding now, huge big-ticket expense, right? Wouldn't it have been easier just to take the Medicare program and apply it to everybody? Currently, Medicare for people 65 and over, right? Why not just take Medicaid, or I'm sorry, Medicare, and let everyone have it? Wouldn't that be a similar cost to what we're doing with Medicaid? You'd probably be able to get rid of Medicaid if we did that.
Sure, you'd effectively have
Right.
Medicaid for everybody.
Yeah.
But I don't think the society's ready to pay the amount of taxes necessary to cover that right now. We may decide that that's appropriate, but I think
But
that's
don't we get ready when people like you lead on the issue?
Yeah.
Isn't that how we get ready for it? But,
don't-
you don't want to lead on that.
No, I think a higher priority for me is balancing the budget and preserving Social Security. I think national health care may come in its own time, but that's certainly not a priority of mine.
Okay.
Yeah, I think, too, it would be a nice thing to lead on. I've talked to a number of Canadians who, because of their work, are now living here, but they love the healthcare system in Canada. And yes, in fact, taxes are higher, housing is higher, groceries are higher, everything's higher, but, you know, they're getting good
But there's a
healthcare.
higher standard of living over
Yeah,
there, probably.
and they're getting very good health care. And this nonsense, this notion of that you have to wait for health care, they said that's just ridiculous. You know, I mean, right now you're waiting for health care if you think about it. I mean, how many times do we call the doctor's office and we can't get in because someone else already has appointments booked up, or you want to have a surgery, well, someone with something a little bit more serious is already booked, you know, so you're still kind of waiting for certain things. You tend to, or in an emergency room, for example, you go in, there everything's done on a priority basis.
Sure.
And this is just what they've been doing in Canada. So I don't know. I tend to agree with these guys. I think it would be a good thing to lead on, but it's your campaign. So thinking of Social Security again, I want to go back to just that for a moment. You know, you are totally opposed to privatizing it. And can you talk a little bit about that and why?
Well, some of the proposals that have come out have talked about diverting that payroll tax to some sort of private saving systems.
Right.
But sometimes the proposals haven't worked out mathematically. I mean, we had one not long ago where they said anyone, I think under age 50, would have their payroll tax diverted into a savings plan. But if you start that at age 50, you're not going to have a significant balance by the time you retire at 65. And the problem with the savings plans are that you end up with this balance. But when you retire, let's say you retire at 65, you don't know if you're going to live to 75 or 105. And if it's a savings plan, you have a real chance of outliving your money. Now, they had talked even about some people being able to take their balance into their estate if they died early. Well, right now, if you die early, that money stays in the pool to help cover the people that live a long time. I mean, the system has an element to it that's almost like an insurance against longevity.
Right.
And you don't want a system where people can outlive their money.
Okay.
Point.
All right.
Emily, did you want to ask the student question, or really any question?
Sure. College affordability, like besides gutting the universities besides gutting the universities of funding and freezing tuition, what are some proposals you have for keeping student loans affordable, as well as lowering interest rates for students overall?
Well, it strikes me that the interest rates on the student loans are too high. And I think a federal subsidized program is a better program. When I got student loans, we didn't pay interest while we were students. The interest didn't start running until you graduated. And right now the interest runs on most of these loans from the time you take out the loans. I also think they should be able to refinance them. If market interest rates are lower and their credit's good, why aren't they allowed to refinance the loans to get a lower rate? It doesn't seem fair to me that you're saying whether your credit's good or not, you have to continue to pay at this rate. And the rates are high compared to the market rates right now. But, you know, again, Mr. Grothman has on his website that he doesn't want universities to raise tuition. And he's missing the whole point. When I was a student, my tuition and fees and other students' tuition and fees paid about 20% of the university's budget. And that was typical all across the country. 80% of university budgets were typically picked up by states.
Right.
And the states recognized that was an investment in their future. What's happened is, since I was a student, those ratios have changed dramatically. Nationally, only about 20% of university budgets are picked up by the states, and 80% is picked up by student fees and tuition. And that explains a fourfold increase in tuition. So the very state politicians who have allowed the state contribution to drop, forcing the student contribution through tuition and fees to rise, are condemning the universities for raising the tuition. That's not right. I would like the federal government to create some system of incentives to encourage states to at least maintain their current level of support, and perhaps even incentives for them to increase the percentage of university budgets that the states support. Because what's happened is this shift off of the state and onto the student is starting to price middle-class families out of college educations, or leaving the kids so indebted that when they graduate, they're deferring things like purchases of cars and homes and marriage, you know, all things that are actually good for the economy.
So what types of incentives would you perhaps want the federal government to impose?
I think the federal government would probably have to put some sort of small match in, like maybe give them some incentive, I don't know how much, but to at least maintain their current level of funding, and then maybe pick up 5 cents on the dollar for increases in the percentage of funding that they're providing. And that would at least give the states to think twice before they reduce their level of support for public institutions.
Okay. We have a lot of issues. I want to move to a different issue, if that's
go
okay.
ahead.
Immigration reform, very contentious. Your opponents seal the border, more deportations, build a wall, things of that nature. I don't even know if they support a pathway to citizenship. What is your view on what needs to happen with immigration, especially the crisis we've got with the children coming over the border?
Yeah, some real tough, because to have an effective immigration law, you have to be able to control the immigration. So we do have to have better control over our border. But we have to recognize we actually need immigrant labor. There's lots of work that would not get done without the immigrant labor. So I think we need to expand a guest worker program to allow more workers to come in. But then we have to enforce our existing safety rules, our minimum wage rules. Because when you don't do that, a couple things are happening. One, you've got people working, below the table. So they're not paying the taxes they would pay, and the employers aren't paying the taxes they would pay, and they're not being paid fairly. And then they're kind of undermining the U.S. wage for other workers that might work in that area. So I think we need a vastly expanded guest worker program with the same protections that we give to other workers, and to make it easier for people to come in to do work. I think we also need to loosen up the immigration laws with regard to people that are getting degrees in this country. We have young people getting, engineering
Right.
and chemistry and highly technical degrees, and then being told they have to leave this country. Even
Yeah.
for some technology companies, they have a real difficulty with their workers moving in and out of the country. I know where my son works, that they have a lot of employees that went to school in the U.S. but are natives of India. And sometimes when they go home and get married, they can't get back into the country, or if they can get back in, they can't bring their spouse.
It's not going to. I'm sorry, Emily. I know it's not going to pass, but the Senate group that got together came up with a bipartisan proposal. It's something like a 14-year path to citizenship. Don't you think that's excessive? We've got some undocumented workers that have been in this country paying taxes for quite a few years. Why not general amnesty for those people?
Here's where it gets a little tricky. You have to be careful not to create incentives for people to come in illegally. And if you're too generous and too easy, then you're enticing other people to come in hopes of the next amnesty. So you gotta have to balance out your compassion with the rule of law. But you don't want to go to the other extreme where you say, everybody's got to leave that's not here legally. The truth is, most of us descend from people
Exactly.
that came to this country before there were any immigration laws.
Right.
This country didn't even have immigration laws until Chinese immigration started,
Right.
and they wanted to discriminate against it.
Exactly.
But, and you mentioned the children. That
Yeah.
is such a tough situation.
You wouldn't support deporting the children, would you?
Well, not exactly. And here's the problem. Again, we don't want to lure more people to send their children or more of these children to come here, because the path is dangerous, and they can overwhelm the systems. And by our own law, we've got to determine, are these immigrants or refugees? And some of them are coming from the most dangerous parts of the world,
Correct.
where drug money, basically money that flowed from this country to buy illegal drugs, has undermined local government. So this may be a novel idea, but what if we developed centers back in these countries that would be operated by the U.S. and made safe, almost be like embassy property, but where these individuals could be returned to their own country but could stay in these facilities if it's necessary for them to be safe, and then the determination could be made whether they were refugees or immigrants. Because if they're refugees, then our laws would say they
Right.
could come into the U.S. But we have to do something so that the flow is stopped. And, your heart tells you to do one thing and your head tells you to do another. And the secret is finding a reasonable compromise.
Right.
I want to touch on immigrant labor. You said that, we need some immigrant labor. Like, what types of jobs are immigrant labor-driven jobs?
Well, actually, in this part of the country, most crops are picked by immigrant labor. These large dairies use a lot of Hispanic workers. Agriculture is a very heavy user of immigrant labor. And there's been attempts to crack down on that. And it often has meant that food products don't get properly harvested. It's not in our interest if there's not a domestic population that's willing and able to do that work.
But if we didn't have the illegal immigrants, Do you not think that we have enough people here out of work who would take on those jobs for the sake of being able to have a job where they're getting paid money?
Where that's been tried, it has not worked. I really think that if you somehow crack down and there wasn't enough people, for instance, to operate the dairies, to do the milking, I don't think you would get enough of the local population to do that. And, you know, there's another longer term aspect of this you have to look at. We're below zero population growth if you take out immigration. So our population isn't growing, it's actually shrinking. And if you took a society, and we have an example of that in Japan. Japan is below the ZPG, and their population is actually decreasing as it ages. So the number of older people being supported by the society are being supported by a diminishing workforce, and they're so anti-immigrant that they don't let a lot of people in to work there. And what it's caused their economy to stagnate.
So this diminished workforce that you're mentioning, would employee outsourcing be a contributing factor to that?
Well, it could be. I mean, certainly if you had a domestic workforce willing and able to do the work, and you outsource it for lower cost labor, that's going to be a negative. That's going to hurt you. But I was more talking about just the fact that with our native-born population declining, that if we didn't have immigration, we would actually be a shrinking society, and it's very difficult to have a successful economy with a shrinking population base, and we've really seen that in Japan, where they've gotten older at a faster rate than they would have if they allowed immigration. Really, if you bring in younger people willing to work, that helps a society that supports its elderly, and we're a society that would like to do that.
But even with that, you don't want to outsource employment, because that would still take employment away from our homeland.
Well, that's right. You'd much rather have the employment be here. And we're going to see some difficulties. You know, manufacturing is something we rely on heavily in Wisconsin. And even if we increase the amount of manufacturing going here, you know, automation and technology are reducing the number of people necessary to support that. So we need to continue looking for new areas, and maybe more people working in technology or more people working with advanced machines is part of the answer. But we shouldn't expect to be able to employ everybody in high-paid jobs if we don't make some changes. And just retaining the existing employers aren't going to do it, because they're going to use less people. It's sort of like, you know, if you go back far enough, most of our population was employed in agriculture. But as agriculture got mechanized, it didn't take nearly as many people, and so it was important that we had other things developing to support the economy.
Go ahead.
The environment. I think that Mr. Grothman, if he's the nominee, has been very critical of climate change. I don't know if he's used the word hoax, but many people on the Republican side have said that climate or global warming is a hoax. I know that you accept that global climate change is real, it's happening, it's man-made and so on, human-made and so on. But what is your solution? Do you support a carbon tax, for example? Or what would you like to see done on climate change?
Well, I do think the government can serve a role in encouraging the improvement of alternative energy. And, you know, sometimes things like wind energy or solar may not have been cost-efficient alternatives initially, but with some government's encouragement or investment, those technologies have advanced, and now they can be competitive. So I think we need to be looking at alternatives. Personally, I think there's still a role for nuclear. You know, nuclear can produce a lot of electricity without a big carbon footprint.
So even after Fukushima in Japan, you still think that nuclear is a potential option?
I think if it's done right, and there are countries that get most of their electricity from nuclear. France is one that gets nearly all of its power from the nuclear. But I think we have to look at all the options. I think that global warming is real. I can understand some people debating what portion is man-made and what portion is natural. But to deny that it's happening is absurd.
Do you support the carbon tax or a cap and trade type of bill or things like that?
I'm open-minded to looking at them.
Okay.
I'm not certain of what my position is on the current proposals.
What about ending subsidies for, say, fossil fuel producers? Any kind of government subsidies?
Well, it does make sense that if we want less fossil fuels to be burned, that we need to take a pretty hard look at those subsidies, and that might be a source of some savings.
Okay. Cheryl?
What about, I want to shift gears now
Sure.
to like gun control.
Okay.
You know, we continue to hear gun control talked about all the time in the media, especially when there's a big massacre of some sort. What is your position on gun control, and how would you move it forward?
Well, actually, the only change that I would push for right now, I like the idea of universal background checks. I just can't see why we wouldn't have that. There should be, you know, you go to a gun shop, and if you have mental illness, a record of mental illness, or criminal activity, you can't buy a gun. I think we want to make that universal. We don't want them to be able to go to a different venue, like a gun show or a private cell, and be able to buy a gun that they couldn't buy at a gun shop. So I would like background checks to be universal. I'm not really ready to push for any other changes with regard to guns at this time.
What about when you talk about universal background checks, what about universal training to be able to carry that weapon or possess that weapon? I mean, I think, you know, when we had the concealed carry passed in this state, that was one of the things that, I mean, they kept going back and forth on how much training you needed in order to get your concealed carry permit. And now it's been so watered down, it's virtually nothing. I mean, would you agree that
I think the
some kind of
training's
uniform
good,
training would be appropriate?
But I'm not sure I want to make that as a mandate before you can buy the weapon. I agree that it would be a good thing, but I'm not prepared to say that I would want that as a mandate. I think the one change I want to push for, and I think it's probably the only change that has a realistic possibility in the near future, is the universal background checks.
But there is evidence, Mark, that when we did have the assault weapons ban during the Clinton years, it did seem to have an impact on the number of really horrendous type of large-scale massacres. In other words, it seemed to work, and then it was gotten away with after 10 years. You wouldn't even support bringing back the assault weapons ban?
Well, I've got to focus on what's possible, and I think, you know, I'm trying to be realistic. What would have a chance of moving forward, and I think if I focus on more than the universal background checks, that I'm less likely to have any success. You know, because we're in a society where if there's even a suggestion of somehow changing the rules with regard to guns, that it causes such a backlash.
Right.
And that's why, you know, you have a Sandy Hook, and then you get this backlash. So I think what's productive is to focus on what's possible, where there's a broad consensus.
I just want to go back because you know you had said that you didn't think you'd be willing to make the training a mandate before they bought the weapon. If it wasn't a mandate before they bought the weapon, what would be their incentive to getting any training once they have the weapon?
Well, I would think most people would want to have adequate training to handle the weapon properly. I would think that would be something that people would inherently want to do, especially if it's a younger person, you know, acquiring weapons for the first time. I would think they would want to have adequate training. And actually, that was the original purpose of the National Rifle Association, was to give gun owners training on how to handle them.
Okay.
I want to shift gears here back to budget and spending. As far as the Highway Trust Fund is concerned, it's become a very, very exhausted fund.
Yes.
So what are your plans to perhaps restore revenue and maybe create for a more long-term solution to infrastructure maintenance, because it's been rough lately?
Well, and this is where I differ markedly from either of my potential opponents. You know, they say they've already taken a no tax, no fee pledge. They can't even talk about a solution that involves new revenues. When I look at the Highway Trust Fund, in a nutshell, the problem is that as our vehicles become more efficient, if you leave the gas tax at its current level, as people use less and less gas to travel, they're paying less and less for maintaining and building bridges and roads. Well, first of all, infrastructure work is important for employment in this economy, and it's important to the safety of the roads and bridges. So if we don't invest enough in highway and bridge maintenance, we're actually leaving a backlog of undone maintenance for our kids. It's like leaving them another debt on top of the national debt. So I say we've got to find the revenues to do that. And there's only a few places to realistically look. You would have to either increase the gas tax or perhaps add some sort of registration fee to high efficiency vehicles. And imagine you've got an electrical vehicle. That's great. That's good for the country because they don't have to import the oil to operate it. But if you've got an electrical vehicle, you're not contributing anything to maintaining roads or bridges. So I would say the gas tax, a registration fee on high efficient vehicles, or you have to take some other real expense, and probably it's something that somebody wants, and reallocate that money to the Highway Trust Fund. But they've got to make a realistic decision and actually allocate something there, and revenues is bound to be part of that equation. So I've not taken an absolute no tax pledge, and I think the real problems we have in some cases, you have to talk about revenues to have a realistic chance to solve the problems.
Okay.
Talking about importing oil, I want to move to the Middle East for just a moment. Don't want to get too bogged down in that because we're running out of time. But I have a concern right now that with the step up in activity in Iraq, that we're going to get involved in another war over there. I know that President Obama says no, but it just seems like, you know, now we're increasing our attacks because one of our American journalists was beheaded earlier this week. So one thing is going to lead to another thing, and I just really fear that that's where we're headed. If you're elected, would you support increased military action in the Middle East?
Well, I'll tell you what I oppose. I oppose ever putting boots on the ground if we don't see an end game. You know, actually, when we went into Iraq and we removed the Central Authority, it was foreseeable that you'd have trouble between the three largest minorities. The Barzani clan that dominate the Kurds, they made it clear that they had no intention in staying in a strong, centralized government dominated by the Arab factions. I think anyone that thought the Sunnis and the Shia could stay together hasn't watched their history. And certainly the government in Baghdad is always trying to balance U.S. pressures off against Iranian pressures. So it was kind of foreseeable that those three groups would pull apart. And then, of course, there's other much smaller minorities that even if this country partitions, are not really going to have anywhere to go. Where will the Assyrian Christians or the Chaldeans or the Yazini, where will any of these groups go if the country gets partitioned? But it was kind of foreseeable that that could happen when you remove the central authority that was holding these diverse groups together. And once we're gone, that is probably going to happen no matter when it occurs. Same thing with Afghanistan. When we leave Afghanistan, the Pashtun majority is going to come back into power, and that will probably look a lot like the Taliban. But that'll happen whether we stay 1 more year or 10 more years or 50 more years. And so before we go into countries with people on the ground, we need to figure out how we get back out and whether it's worth that cost.
Just a quick question, totally different topic. We're running out of time. Mr. Grothman has said if he's elected, he'll serve no more than 5 terms. He'll term limit himself to 10 years. Would you term limit yourself?
We're both 59 years old. We'll both be ready to retire by then.
One other thing. Grothman, I believe, is the only candidate who announced that he was running even while Mr. Petri was still in office.
That's correct.
The rest of you waited until Petri stepped down. So why could we not make the argument that Grothman is the candidate who really wanted this? He was willing to put his neck out there even while the incumbent was still there. You waited.
Yeah, I would not have run against Tom Petri.
Why?
I like Tom Petri. I know him pretty well. And he also had $900,000 in the bank. So I would have felt uncomfortable running against him while he was a sitting congressman, but I also know that I would be unlikely to win against that type of war chest. So,
Okay.
I think what you're saying is true.
How much money do you expect to be spent in this race when all is said and done, with all the outside spending and what you and your potential opponent will spend?
I have no idea, but I can tell you Dewey Strobel put $800,000 of his own money in, and he's out of this race. There's a lot of money involved. I don't have that kind of money, so it's going to have to be a different type of campaign for me.
Okay.
And quite frankly, I think there's too much money spent
I agree.
in politics. It should be a battle of ideas, not a battle of pocketbooks.
And that's why we hope that your opponent comes on this show.
Yes.
I hope it'll be a battle of ideas.
Yeah, absolutely. We are down to, I think, about 3 minutes here. So, Emily, do you have anything real quick?
I was just gonna, building off of your campaign and speak. Do you think that there should be a limit on how much certain companies or corporations can donate to campaigns?
Well, I know corporations are not people, because if they were, there would have been some of them in jail. And I've never seen a corporation in my jail. So, yeah, we've got a bad situation now where money is in control, and for some politicians, the art of politics has become the art of betraying the public interest in favor of narrowed moneyed interests that can afford to write campaign contributions. And I'm afraid that's really corrupted the system. And look, if you can pass a law that shifts all the taxes off manufacturers and leave the public to pick that up either through cuts in services they value or for future increases in their taxes, and then those corporations, the owners of them and the leaders of them, can make large campaign checks, that's leading to a system where we're governed by money and not by the public.
There is a
anymore.
grassroots movement across the nation to amend the U.S. Constitution to make it clear that corporations are not people. Would you support amending the U.S. Constitution?
I think I would.
Good.
Would you support any other kind of campaign reform?
Sure. I would have to know the specifics, but and the problem you bump into is the free speech issues. Is the ability to give money where you want to give it for a campaign, is that free speech? It's a little tricky, but I know that if some people can buy all the speech and then other people are deceived as to what's true and what's not, that undermines democracy. I'm also worried that as newspapers become less prevalent, that's going to undermine democracy as well, because it's the print media that usually goes into the detail, although this show is doing a good job right now.
Thank you. Thank you. And to wrap things up, why don't you look into camera one and just take about 20 seconds or so and tell folks why they should vote for you.
Well, I think people want politicians that tell them what they believe to be true and not just what the public wants to hear. I think they want politicians that are going to look for real solutions to the real problems that society faces, not to politically drummed up problems. And I want to be your next congressman. Thank you.
All right. And we have been, I believe, putting your website address up throughout the hour, but in case someone has missed it, it is harrisforwisconsin.com, and the 4 is written out. It is not the numeral 4. So harrisforwisconsin.com. Mark, thanks very much for being here. Good luck to you.
Thank you
All
for
right.
the opportunity.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
And thanks to all of you. Thanks to Tony and Emily and to the crew, and we'll see you next time. Until then, take good care. Keep your eye on us. We've got our eye on Oshkosh.